Let's say you've been watching woodworking videos for a while now and you finally decided to dive in and you went out and you bought your first table saw. And now that you've got it out of the box and you set it up, it looks a little intimidating. Hi, welcome to Woodworking for Mere Mortals, a channel dedicated to empowering beginning woodworkers to learn woodworking without any fear. My name is Steve, and in this video, I want to take you through all the steps you'll need for making your first cuts on a table saw. I'll assume you already have a saw, so this won't be a buying guide. I'll cover the most common beginner questions in this video, but feel free to ask anything else in the comments. I try to answer as many as I can, but I also encourage other experienced woodworkers to help me out and answer whatever you can. I actively monitor my YouTube comments in order to keep it a helpful, judgment-free, friendly space. There are no dumb questions when it comes to using power tools, especially a table saw. And before we get started, if you're looking for a comprehensive, step-by-step, no-nonsense approach to learning woodworking, check out my online courses over at theweekendwoodworker.com. You'll be able to build your first project this weekend, no experience necessary. And while you're there, be sure to download my free guide to setting up a shop for under $1,000. You probably already have a general idea of what you can do with a table saw and why I consider it the most important, versatile tool in any modern, power tool-based home woodworking shop. Most any cut that a table saw makes can be made with other tools such as a circular saw or a bandsaw, but a table saw makes them faster, easier, and with far more precision, accuracy, and repeatability. Really about the only kind of cut you can't make on a table saw is a curved cut. A table saw is really a very simple tool. It's basically a more powerful upside down circular saw mounted to a table. And instead of moving the saw through the wood, you move the wood through the saw, which gives you better control. As a side note, there are people who have made their own table saws by mounting a circular saw under a table, but unless you're an experienced woodworker, don't try this. There are just too many safety considerations, and making it accurate is pretty tedious. It would be a terribly frustrating and potentially dangerous way to begin your woodworking hobby. My saw is an older Porter cable saw given to me nearly 10 years ago by a bunch of viewers. It's developed quirks over the years, but it still works great, and it's a good example of a very basic saw. Everything I show you on this will be very similar to just about any entry-level table saw you might have. This saw may look big, but really the saw is just this middle part. These two sides are extension tables. All table saws will have a motor that spins a blade. The blade is held onto a post called an arbor with a nut. Make sure you install the blade with the teeth facing towards you and don't over tighten the nut, just get it snug. The blade will spin towards you. If it spun the other way, the wood would just shoot out the other end. There's a lot of different types of saw blades, but I pretty much use a 50-tooth combination blade for everything. The blade can be raised and lowered with a crank at the front of the saw, allowing you to cut wood of different thicknesses. There will also be a mechanism for tilting the blade so that you can make beveled cuts. Mine has a crank to do that. The gauge to read how many degrees that bevel is not very accurate on mine, so I use a digital bevel finder for making accurate bevel cuts. The most important thing here is to make sure that your blade locks in accurately at 90 degrees to the table. That's where you'll mostly have it set, and you can just check that with a square. Your saw will come with a riving knife. The riving knife is the most important safety feature on your saw. It prevents kickback. Never cut all the way through lumber without it in place. Your saw will come with a blade guard, maybe similar to this one. As a new woodworker, use it. It's there to prevent wood from dropping on the blade or your hand from skimming across it. That said, I rarely use one myself. I've laid out my specific reasons in a separate video called Why Do So Many People Remove Their Table Saw Blade Guards? Click on the link in the description. Again, as a new woodworker, you should use every safety accessory that comes with your saw. Once you've installed the blade and the riving knife, you'll need to drop in an insert plate. This creates a narrower gap, preventing wood cutoffs from dropping down into the housing, and it'll give you a good, cleaner, safer cut. Never operate a saw without an insert plate installed, and make sure that it's flush with the top of of the table. Most saws will come with a dust port in the back. I hook up a shop vac into mine, but there are other dust collection options. Removing sawdust at the source will make cleanup a lot easier and keep your shop a lot less messy. Plus, there'll be a lot less dust floating around the air. Table saws come with two methods for supporting wood when making a cut. On the table, there will be a groove on each side of the blade called a miter slot. It's used for a mitered gauge. A miter gauge is used to support the wood when making cross cuts, usually against the grain of the wood. And like the name implies, you can rotate it for making angled or mitered cuts. Most miter gauges that come with saws look something like this. If you want, you can upgrade to something fancier like this one that a viewer sent me a while back. It's a little bit much for my saw, but man is it accurate, and I use it all the time. The second support accessory is a rip fence. This will have a clamping mechanism that lets you position it as close to the blade as needed. And it's used for making rip cuts. Those are cuts that go along the length of a board in the same direction as the grain. Most saws will have a ruler to help you set the distance between the rip fence and the blade. Mine isn't even close to accurate, so I always just measure each cut with a tape measure. Whenever you're cutting all the way through a board, use either the miter gauge or the rip fence, never both at once. And never attempt to freehand cut a board without any support. Plug your saw into an outlet, put on a pair of safety glasses and hearing protection. Make sure there's nothing on the table obstructing the blade and flip the switch on. Get a feel for how the machine reacts when powered on and the noise it makes. The noise from a saw can be a little jarring the first time you hear it, even with hearing protection in place. Go ahead and turn it on and off a few times, especially get used to turning it off. A lot of saws will let you stop it with your knee, so you can do it really quickly, even without cutting anything. You should be getting a sense for the saw's power. Don't fear that power, but always respect it. Let's start with a crosscut. For this, remove the rip fence and set it aside. Install your miter gauge in the left miter slot. Test to make sure it slides easily and that there's no play side to side. It should have a way to adjust it if it's a little bit loose. Grab a scrap board. I'll use a 1x4 for this example. Raise the blade up so that it's a little bit higher than the thickness of the wood. There's some debate about this lately, with some people contending that raising the blade up as high as possible will result in a better cut, but I get perfectly fine cuts with the blade lower, and I feel that the less of the blade that's exposed, the safer the cut. So let's say you want to cut this board to 12 inches long. Measure and make a mark at the 12-inch point. I don't usually draw a line, but I will here. The important thing to keep in mind when making any cut is knowing which side of the line to cut on. Rarely, if ever, do you want to cut straight down the middle of a line, because you want to consider the kerf or the thickness of the blade and how much material that will remove. Since this is my work piece, the 12-inch piece that I want to use for the project, I want to make sure to line the teeth of the blade up with the outside of the line. Otherwise, my board would be short about 1/8 of an inch, and that matters. When possible, I prefer to have the workpiece, the part I measured and I want to use, supported with the miter gauge. But sometimes you need to support the cutoff or waste side. Don't try to support a tiny piece of wood against the miter gauge where it would just be tippy. Use common sense. Once you've lined up your cut, pull the miter gauge and board back together away from the blade. In addition to the safety glasses and hearing protection, put on a respirator mask. Now's when I want you to imagine your cut. I do this for every procedure, no matter how simple. Make it a habit. Imagine the cut you're about to make. How are you going to turn on the saw? How will you hold the wood against the miter gauge? Where will you position your body throughout the cut? What will you do after the board is cut? And most of all, imagine where your hands will be throughout the entire procedure, from the moment you turned on the saw to the moment you turn it off. Establishing this habit will become even more important as you learn to make more complicated cuts. Turn on your shop vac or dust extractor if you have one and power up the saw. With the board in place and firmly held against the miter gauge, position your body to the left of the blade. Never make a crosscut in line with the blade. If a cutoff piece were to kick back at you, you don't want to be in its path. Again, with your riving knife in place, kickback will be far less likely to occur. Slowly push the miter gauge forward and through the blade. The first time you make a cut, you might be surprised how easily it cuts. After the cut is made, pull the board away from the miter gauge with your left hand and pull the miter gauge back to the front of the saw. And shut off your saw. Resist the temptation to reach over the blade to retrieve the cutoff piece. Just let it sit there until the saw has stopped. You'll use the rip fence for ripping boards, cutting them lengthwise into narrower boards, but you'll also find it handy for cutting plywood and other larger sheet goods. A good rule of thumb is to use the rip fence for any board that's longer than it is wide. Making a cross cut, for instance, with the rip fence could cause the board to twist and bind between the fence and the blade, causing kickback. Again, use common sense here. When using the rip fence, your workpiece will almost always be against the fence and the cutoff part will be on the other side of the blade. This will give you complete control of the piece you're working on throughout the entire cut. Making cuts with the rip fence will require you to use either a push stick or a push block. I always use a gripper from Microjig. No, this isn't an ad, but I'll include a link for this down in the description. It fully supports the wood through the entire cut, giving me cleaner cuts, and it keeps my hands safe. A lot of people are more comfortable using push sticks, which is probably what your saw came with. Whatever you choose, don't ever use your fingers for the complete procedure. Let's say I need a board that's 2 inches wide. So what I'll do is measure 2 inches from my rip fence to one of the teeth on the blade. Like cross-cutting and all other cuts, remember to account for the kerf of the blade. So obviously if I measured from the outside of the blade here, my board would be too narrow. As always, do an imaginary dry run, envisioning where your hands will be throughout the entire cut and how you'll position your push sticks or push block. You'll want to position those push sticks or push block wherever you'll be able to reach them during the cut. Turn on the saw and set the board against the rip fence. For the first part of the cut, you'll probably need to use your hands to guide the wood into the blade, especially on longer boards. Push forward with your right hand and use your left hand to press the board toward the fence. Keep your hands at least 6 inches from the front and the side of the blade. As the end of the board gets closer to the blade, you'll need to grab the push sticks. Hook one over the end of the board, pressing forward as well as downward. Continue pushing the board all the way through the blade, completing the cut using the push sticks. The gripper push block will give you much better control, and you only need one, although it's handy to have two for long boards so that you can leapfrog them during the cut. One tip I always like to mention when using a rip fence is to keep your eye focused on the fence, not the blade, when you're making cuts, to ensure that the workpiece and the fence are in constant contact with each other. For even more videos to help you get started using a table saw, be sure to check out my table saw skills playlist. Thanks for watching, everybody.